we can start.
So, good morning, everyone. Esteemed guests, researcher scholars, my dear faculty members and participants, I welcome you all to the third day of our faculty development program titled Envisioning the Future, Multidisciplinary Approaches in Research on Languages and Literature. It is wonderful to see such enthusiastic participation as we continue exploring the intersections of disciplines, ideas, and methodologies. For today's session, we are honored to have among us Dr. Sushant Kumar Mishra, sir, Professor and Dean at the School of Languages and Literature Humanities, Nalanda University. Sir is a distinguished academic with a dual PhD, one in French from Delhi University and another in linguistics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. His area of expertise span applied linguistics, translation studies, comparative literature, and semiotic traditions in Indic and European context. With a career spanning over 3 decades, Dr. Mishra has contributed significantly to academic excellence at institutions such as Delhi University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and IFLU. Beyond academia, his leadership has enriched Nalanda University through initiatives like international seminars and innovative programs. Today, Sir will deliver a session on identity, history, revisiting the apparent obvious, seamlessly aligning with the FDP's goal of fostering multidisciplinary inquiry. This session promises to deepen our understanding of the nuanced relationship between history, identity, and literature. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sushant Kumar Mishra, sir, for this highly anticipated session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for such nice and kind words and making me nervous
Not
by
at all, sir.
putting the daunting task before me. I know all our esteemed panelists here, all of them are young, energetic assistant professors and young researchers. And younger mind is always more brilliant than the fossilized minds. So whatever I will say, I
But they
would
can always
expect.
learn from your wisdom and experience, sir.
Yes, yes. Wisdom and experience is the only thing I have. Knowledge they have. So that's all right. That's all right. What I want to say that in case if there is some comments, etc., you are welcome. You raise your hand and we can try to make it an interactive session also as much as possible. Otherwise,
Sure, sir.
at the end also we can interact. We will have hopefully sufficient time for interaction at the end
Sure,
also.
sir.
Yes, so thank you. So now as you can see in the slide itself, uh, the identity history, revisiting the apparent obvious. Now we see these 2 points are actually very commonly understood. We all have an identity, whether we are aware or not. Now, the awareness is very important in our contemporary times, and there is a historical legacy to it. So I'm just trying to see that how in our research, we have several theories. A lot of you would be talking about liminality and post-structuralist understanding of identities, etc. Identity is a favorite subject in postmodernist discourses also. Plus, I was just today looking at other topics. They also talk about language teaching and others, similar topics. Identity forms a very important part of it. So I've gone to overboard to some of these fields, and I have tried to see that what is apparent obvious in this field, that it is apparent. See, apparent or obvious, both of them are actually synonymous. So, but still I preferred putting this apparent obvious as an adjective and then the noun, because obvious I put it as noun here in this context. Because perhaps things which should have been very obvious to us, we have overlooked. And that's what we do always in research, because things which somehow get marginalized in our discourses, we need to bring them to center stage, the famous deconstructionist approach. I will just try to look at some of these aspects. Several others we can discuss at the end or during question answer sessions. So first is that you see which are the language contact situations. Language contact situations. Why do I say language contact situation? Because we're dealing with language, but you can very easily replace language contact situation as identity contact situations. So history has its own course, language contact situations. Whether we talk of Greeks coming to India in 3rd, 4th century BC or whatever be the period, or you take any period, there would be some movement of people, whether internal movement of people or people from some outward geographical or sometimes cultural places. There are several debates on this. Nowadays, you hear a lot about the Aryans as indigenous people of India and Aryans coming outside of India, and all these debates will be there. So one fact is certain. The history, I don't know at this stage. I will not enter into that debate to understand it, but this is a fact that there is certainly a language contact situation that we have faced. Whether we have gone outside or somebody has come inside doesn't matter at all. And here, language is the first victim, and also being a victim, it becomes a beneficiary. How? Because language gets enriched. Whether our language changes, you can see it's a lot of changes happening in most of the Indian languages in our contemporary times. A lot of new terms are being created. So what is the identity formation that is happening through the language exchange processes? And the language exchange processes are very important. In history, whatever be the world power center, whether you see Baghdad school, simultaneously you see a Baghdad school of translation. When you see Toledo in Spain, you see Toledo School of Translation simultaneously emerging. Today you see United States. There are lots of translation activities going on in those areas. And they have identity issues. They have several cultural amalgamation issues. All of them will be very obvious to us. I can give you just one example in this context. All of you would have done Abhigyan Shakuntalam by Kalidas at some or the other stage during our coursework of graduation, masters, whatever. Now you see the first translation of Kalidas. That was by William Jones, first translation towards English. And you look at the cover, it is free download available. The text is not a Sanskrit text according to William Jones' translation. It was published, if I remember correctly, around 1872. That you can check. I'm not very good at dates, but around that period it was published. And you will find that it says Sanskrit and Prakrit. Now you see two languages being placed together by a very important, eminent scholar who translated for the first time. And in such works, he has provided us extremely important methodologies that has led us to all kinds of Indo-European layers of studies. Later translations, if you see, the question of identity comes there. The word Prakrit has been removed. You see later, Arthur Ryder has translated, several others. There is a Clay Sanskrit series, then several others you will find. In all those translations, it becomes only a Sanskrit text. So how this transformation of identity takes place of a text? The textual identity in terms of language is Sanskrit and Prakrit, and it has gone only to Sanskrit. Now, in today's time, do we not need to rediscover this? What is the actual identity of Kalidas? Is he a Sanskrit dramatist or a Prakrit dramatist, or both? How do we understand the very notion of language? What is language? When we identify a text, we have to identify the language of the text. And I have just given you a clear example where the language itself becomes the victim and the beneficiary, because you see, Prakrit has been forgotten. At the same time, Prakrit could be beneficiary because somewhere down the line it is bound to come with a greater force, and that is what is happening today. You can see Prakrit, which was relegated, and you see the recent government action. It may be political, but politics brings power, and language is closely related to politics. That you can see, whether in India or in Europe, anywhere. Nations have been created on the name of language. So that's where language, and the language which is a carrier of culture as literature. First pointer will be language. So you can see recently the government of India declares Prakrit as a classical language. So resurgence that is happening. Now you go back to the text. You will find that something that is so obvious that Sanskrit is not in, does not exist in isolation. But somewhere in our discourses, we have forgotten it. So what is the difference between Sanskrit and Prakrit? This becomes a very important issue. And that will lead to economy and politics also, because that is part of the Prakrit languages. How can an economy survive without the natural and informal speech patterns, whichever be the language? I understand that this institution with which we are interacting today, that is the platform provided, is perhaps somewhere in Tamil Nadu. Does entire Tamil Nadu speak the same language, or is it possible in any place? That becomes a very important point. And you see, centuries of efforts also have not unified all of us in terms of one unified code of, or linguistic code of any particular language. The variations remain. So this is just the beginning. There's some examples I've given you for the contact situations. And it can be very interesting at various points. This text, all of you know, another example. Persepolis is a very famous text. It is a French graphic novel. It is translated in, at least in Hindi for sure, but published by Vani Prakashan in Hindi. And I would presume that it would have already been translated in Bengali and Marathi and Malayalam, because they are the avant-garde languages which always translate. But at least in Hindi, it's certainly available. Now you see a very important point here. It is a French graphic novel written by whom? Written by a native speaker of Persian who lived most of her life in Germany. Why? Because she left due to political reasons. Again, politics is a very important pointer here. Due to political reasons, she left her homeland. She had to leave her homeland along with her family. And the family settled somewhere in Germany as a political refugee due to the cultural revolution that happened in Iran. The aristocracy was deposed, and this lady was part of the family which belonged to aristocracy. She chooses to write her story, Persepolis. Now, you know the story of Persepolis. Persepolis, historically, I mean to say, not exactly this text, but Persepolis is a very important metaphor for any city. It has been a very important city in the past. And Iran, it becomes a symbol of Iran. So here is an Iranian origin person who writes this novel, staying in Germany, and the language she chooses is not her language by any means. She has learned German almost as a native, because she lived since her childhood in German-speaking areas. And in her family, and as a child, she has learned Iranian, that is Persian, one particular variety of Persian, definitely. Now, why the novel is written in French? This is a question of identity. She cannot identify herself as an Iranian or as a Persian speaker, and she cannot identify herself as a German speaker. When she goes to Iran, she is considered a German or a European, and vice versa. In Germany or in Europe, she is considered an Iranian. So what is her identity and what is her language? Which is her language and identity? The issue comes there. So the history has played a very important role here. And this is true for a lot of us, because in India, we live in such situations where you see your children, or many of you, when you migrate, which is your language? To which culture do you belong to? That becomes a very important issue. And these are a few responses that you find, that finally the language selected is French. And there is no reason why the language should be connected to culture in this context. So the obvious connection, that's why I said apparent obvious, the obvious connection between language and culture is getting challenged in our times. Or perhaps in past also this has happened that way. I will try to come to such examples, but this is a very contemporary example. You can see late 20th century and early 21st century, a text of this particular period. And you see French animated serial also came of it, and that also gets an award. So why French animated serial? You don't find the animated serials in Persian and so many other languages on the basis. And when it is being translated into Hindi, you see Hindi has a particular status among Indian languages, at least a political status is given. It is not a national language. We don't have any notion of national language, but Hindi is supposed to be one of the important linked languages for Indian people. And it is presented in this manner, in this context. So if a translation of such a text which poses challenge, which gives a context in which certain kind of acculturization is taking place, is translated into Hindi, you see that there is a contradiction. How do we see Hindi? How Hindi itself can present such an idea to its readers, to its native readers, if at all there are really native readers for any language. But because reading is something that we all learn, so there is no nativity given to reading or any such act where we do where we don't speak and we don't listen. Listening and speaking are the native abilities, but reading is something and writing is something that we always learn. Writing also has its own code. So in that context, how do we understand the relationship between language, content, and culture? And this we need to understand. So this is just an example. And Marjan Satrapi is an example for such writings. There are several others. You can see similar tendencies in other writers also. Jhumpa Lahiri has done it. She has written it in Italian. Italian is not her language at all. And you will find several such contemporary writers also taking up an imagining language. So there is something that the imaginaire, the imagined language that it comes. And this becomes a very important issue in our times. So you can see that several issues that we have in our contemporary times try to resolve even at the level of liminality gets further questioned, because where do you place even in liminality, even the apparent border between the two places which are very apart, and the question of identity in that context, Europe, Iran, and the language chosen is France. And France is also not necessarily only of France, because French is spoken not only in France, but in several other countries of Europe and several other parts of the world. So when a language that is selected, such as French, then the issue is much beyond the borders of Europe. It could have been English, but English is not chosen, whatever be the reasons. There could be political reasons, because English itself has a dominance, similar type of dominance that I am talking about Hindi at the world level. And that dominance is certainly economic and political, and that leads to several other issues that opens up kind of Pandora's box that we all face. So the question of cultural identity and the language in that context is a burning issue in our contemporary times. Whatever be the discourse we have, post-colonial, post-modernist, whatever be the discourses that we have talked about, this aspect has not been really addressed in our contemporary discourses, which we need to understand and delve deeper to understand how identity is being created in our contemporary times, because exile is a very important issue, and most of us are in exile. Whether we talk of different kinds of literature which is written in exile, because people have chosen to go, like Indians living up in many countries of the world. So you give various names to such literatures. You have Anglophone literatures from various parts of the world, Francophone literatures, and several other names can be used. But where is our exile and where is our identity? It can happen within the same space also, because we have linguistic differences, we have cultural differences within the same areas. And not only that, we have examples where we are linguistically close, and sometimes we can be culturally and culture can be extremely different. For example, Bengali is spoken in India and Bengali is spoken in Bangladesh. Suppose we enter into the debate, which is a foreign language. And if we say that Bengali is a foreign language, Bangladesh is a country from abroad. So we are not totally wrong. Nepali is another issue. So we have several such languages. Hindi, varieties of Hindi are spoken in far distant lands like Fiji, and there are extremely important novelists who have written in such countries. So which is our identity, and how do we correlate it with exile as well as domestication, as well as domestic concepts? So foreignization and domestication, though theorists have given it in context of translation studies, but they become very important in the context of identity formation also. We need to theorize, we need to think more and more about it. And the content itself, because the language itself has several layers. Some examples I can give you here. And Asterix, all of you know about it. It is available in several animated series also. But if you look at it, the classic forms, it is one of the classics in French literature. And the French that is used, though it is considered to be very high level content in terms of literature, and the language that is used is of extremely extremely rich, and has several poetic devices, and it plays at various levels in expressions, in expressing the ideas. But still, the language used is mostly informal and sometimes extremely informal. Now what happens? The classic forms of great animated classics are not available generally. Why? We hardly find such texts as part of our university curricula. Why? These questions come to us. And there are several types of influences that you find. See, the people who created that person is from Belgium. One of the person who used to write the dialogue is from Belgium. But no Belgium connection directly in the text. The content is acculturated because everything is given in the context of the Latin, of the Roman civilization, Roman culture, pre-Christian Roman culture. So all the comments that are being made, all the comments related to economy, related to politics that are being made, they have been acculturated to our contemporary times. So you see, we are transgressing the European identity. The content is given in French, but just by presenting the whole content in the context of the Roman culture, pre-Christian Roman civilization, the content has been acculturated from the contemporary times, and thus the identity has been transgressed. You can see similar ideas that are applicable to various political situations in various countries of Europe directly, and by implication, you can apply it to several other democracies of the world. So the content, is it really rooted in any culture? That becomes a question for us. So can content of any literary piece be acculturated in terms of language as well as in terms of ideas? That becomes a question for us, and we need to focus on such aspects in our times. Even the extent of vulgarity, often reflecting non-cultured variety of French, that is there in Asterix. I'm referring to the text of Asterix. You have several such texts which you find, because see, there is a text in French which provides you the basis for good usages in a language, or rather correct usages in a language. That is the name of the text is in italics here, but these are not followed in our times, and especially in high literary pieces like Asterix and several such texts, they don't follow it. You have several thinkers like that. You have a very important 20th century writer, Houellebecq. He is not ready to write in that language, and his content also can be questioned in our contemporary times, because the very idea of the clash of civilizations between Islamist and Christian civilizations have undergone various transformative stages in understanding identity. So there several such issues are there. So the questions on culture and the values that is contained in the culture, that has come before us because our content, our production, literary production, our cultural production don't remain any more rooted in culture, in one culture. They keep evolving as per the evolution of the cultural narratives, which keep taking influences from across the world. So you see, I have given you some examples here also. So in India, we can talk about freedom in the same tone, and that too on the name of left discourse, but experience of USSR and China have been different. So even in terms of identity of USSR, identity of China, which are mostly autocratic powers, and several such examples you will find. We can talk of freedom. Even under Hitler, there was a talk of freedom, but what was the definition of freedom and how the cultural narratives were shaped in those contexts? That we have to understand. So identity is becoming more and more complex, more and more. We have some examples from Canada. Canada is always a very important part of our political discourse in contemporary times. But you can observe what I have written here. You can observe it for last 3 decades, at least, if not more, maybe a little more. But for last 3 decades, road signs are in Gurumukhi only because that's the requirement. So which is the identity? And not only that, when a child from India goes and migrates to Canada, stays in Gurudwara, and after some time starts getting amalgamated, starts getting part of the part and parcel of the Canadian society, starts taking part in the economic activities, and gradually becomes a very active participant in the culture of Canada, various parts of Canada. Some parts welcome such interventions from other peoples. Where is the question of identity? Because the child has gone as a refugee, and from refugee to society at large. You have several such issues. Tibetan identity in India, you can notice it. Today, several Tibetan people, they are not only looking themselves as a Tibetan refugee, but they have moved ahead. And it gets reflected in some of their cultural productions also. So we are living in a space of language cauldron, as I understand. And this has been in past also. This is there in contemporary times also. And from past, I give you an example of Pali. Literally, the linguists tell us that Pali is a language as a spoken in the marketplace, something, a kind of parallelism that you find in the notion of Koine, Koine, Koine Greek or Koine Arabic, both are very important. So commoners Arabic, commoners Greek. Koine language in Greece was very important, and many times you will find that even the New Testament uses Koine language, the Koine Greek language. So a kind of cauldron is continuously surrounding us, and there, where is the identity? How do we understand identity in terms of cultural productions, in terms of linguistic productions? It is there. So some of the debates that I have taken from contemporary times, I see this a lot, such debates, whether foreign language should be part of the schools or not, whatever regional linguistic divisions that we have. Where do we place Sanskrit? Where do we place Hindi? Which are the schools under CBSE or ICSE that will teach which language, and not only the dominant mode of production of the students, but just as a language course, what will we teach? Which literatures will we take? If you take the book of CBSE or NCRT, which are the stories that we have to take? How many stories do we take from Indian writers who are writing in English or who are available in translation? Or how many of Asian, or how many of ASEAN country writers are being selected? All these issues are related to identity, and we don't even know that several of our curricula are not are not sufficiently representative of the Eastern cultural identities. By Eastern, I include Far East. For example, you see this year's Nobel laureate. How many of us were aware of the writings in terms of curricula? Of course, as individuals, we have read it. But in terms of curricula, how many of us have included Chinese writings, South Korean writings, etc., and all these Eastern writings? Where is the identity being formed in our mind, in our universities, in our language and such research related to language and literature and culture productions? To such research productions, they become very important. How many of have written prior to getting Nobel Prize on such authors who are from Eastern societies? You will find authors from Europe and other places becoming very important. But sometimes the texts are available. Americans can study it, but we don't study Latin American literatures. Though we have some Spanish representations, 100 Years of Solitude and such, which have become kind of cliches. But if you see their Spanish importance, you will find that they are not important. Okay? So in that context, we have to understand that more and more research is required in these fields. So of course, these are very important aspects for understanding culture and interlanguage situations, because we operate in two types of situations: endolinguistic and exolinguistic situations. When we study the language, I have given you earlier examples. French is being used in outside its context. English is being used outside its context. And in Indian context, where do we place English or several Indian languages? Is English an endolinguistic situation in India? How many Indian speakers are there for English? How many varieties of English do we speak? Experts say that 5 to 10% people only know English. So is English an Indian language in that context? Does it have any social base? Of course, English is a very important language and it is being used in India. But can we say that it is an Indian language, except for that it has an official status and hence it is an Indian language? Okay, that kind of syllogism is fine. I can understand it. But in terms of its cultural productions, where do we place English? And we have a very important writing from Indian English writers, right from Nissim Musical and till Jhumpa Lahiri I have cited. Some of them live abroad, some of them have lived in India. Nissim Musical lived in India. And he's very much rooted in his culture from Western India. At that time, Konkani, Marathi, where will we place it? So was he writing in a language that was exolinguistic to him or endolinguistic to him? Related to identity, related to his cultural production, how do we think? What are our thought processes? So we have interlanguage situations, okay? And there are many such examples. You can see from earlier also, I can give you that from Turkish, we have seen it, Ottomans and Eastern Roman Empire. When they invaded Europeans, the traces of cultural evolution was not there much, for the simple reason that the Turks, they had not produced a lot of literary ideas that could have influenced the European mind. But that you can see that even the word Byzantine in various contexts is not used as a symbol of high culture. Of course, earlier Byzantine, yes, and that also we will see gradually the internal contradictions of the productions of these scholars from the Byzantine. So you see, this is the example that I have given you, from 1552 Ottomans. They have gone to Italy, but traces of influences are much less. There is hardly any cultural identity amalgamation. There is a language contact situation. I have discussed about it, but here is an example where the language contact situation has not brought a lot of changes in the formation and evolution of the identity. So this is one example, and all these events you can see. And again, something apparent obvious, we don't study these influences so far as I know in our university systems, and understand how Europe was transformed due to these exchange of people, whether in terms of war or peace, both, and how it influenced our minds, the modernist mind of Europe, which subsequently has pervaded across the world. So these aspects are very important. Similar aspects are there in several other European countries also. Spain, you find several such examples. The 16th century is very important century. You know about it, but 1552 is this. And prior to that, 1492, again, you can take it as a date and you see several such events. Like, for example, one thing which often internet also doesn't tell us, if you take 1492, there are several important events in 1492. One important event is that for the first time, we have a modern grammar of Spanish written and published in 1492. Now, you see, earlier grammar means Latin grammar, that's all. In Europe, at least, and Greek and classical Greek grammar. But modern language grammars, we can debate how much linguistically they are correct. That's a different issue. But at least there was an attempt to write the grammar. Such publications have shaped our mind. And there are certain cultural influences due to that, because the moment you publish a grammar and you give a status to the language, that leads to politics and several types of economic activities that we notice in Spain, Portugal, and subsequently till Italian, we notice it. So this kind of Western influences we will find, and you can see a lot. Maximum we go is still the Arab influences on the Greeks, etc. That is there. But we have a very important aspect of language contact and cultural identity. A very important poet like Sappho. You know Sappho? All of you would have studied Sappho. Sappho was found, her texts were found in Turkish and Arabic lands. Where is Sappho? Where do you place Sappho? Here is an old Greek poet or poetess whose texts are kept in Turkish, are maintained in Turkish by scholars who are dedicated either to Orthodox Christianity or to some extent some are Islamic Christianity, some Islamic scholars also. Now, neither Christianity nor Islam would accept the spirit of Sappho, that you know, all the debates of LGBT, etc., and the religious intervention in such situations, you can see. But who maintained Sappho? So what was the cultural identity of those scholars who thought that they were doing a very pious act by keeping the manuscripts and just by maintaining the manuscripts by simply reproducing it? And at the same time, they were religious scholars. So their identity was somewhere religious and somewhere beyond religion also. That becomes a very important aspect for us. And you find similar notices in our Indian you do notice similar situations in our contemporary Indian culture. So the Arabic knowledge that passed on gradually, and Sappho, Aristotle, yes, Aristotle we all have talked, but the origin of Sappho and how Sappho was maintained and what was the response and what all could have been the responses of religious scholars regarding the writings of Sappho, these aspects we need to further understand in the context of identity, in the context of identity formation, because Sappho is becoming a part here of that religious pious act, which tells that we must maintain the manuscripts. And this is a contradiction within the identity. But we have done it. It has happened in past. So our bias today against or for religion is immaterial because it is a fact that it has happened. So we need to understand the psychology, the identity of such people as they are very important, they remain very important for us also. Similar ideas you will find in Greece. So these ideas we have studied. So they were influenced largely by Phoenicians. By some accounts, even their script has come from Phoenicians. So Romans could hardly accept it all. Why? Because Romans were imperialist powers. Greeks were not imperialist. If you see Latin, a lot of texts directly go to Greeks. You have a lot of cultural heroes by which Romans identified themselves. They go to Greeks. But you see a very important difference in identity. Here is an imperialist identity under Roman. You can see the writings of Shadi Bartz, Shaadi and Bartszz. She's a very good scholar, a Latinist, and she writes about this. We have to understand that how imperialist monotheism adopts and understands the pagan diversity of cultural identity. Greeks were pagan, and the pagan diversity existed there. But how a monotheistic culture tries to adapt it from imperialist Rome, imperialism was there as one unifying factor. And later you will find that another unifying factor that is part of religion, the Christianity, how you find similar responses. While Longinus becomes a very important author, he has his own point, but the notion of sublimity, if you put in this context, we need to revisit such texts. So from 16th century, I've told you that this is the second context. One was that imperialist context. The second was the religious empire was there. The religious empire of that Charlemagne, the Carla Magna, whatever, 9th century onwards, 8th, 9th century onwards, that remains very important. And we have to understand how simply politically imperialist powers and how the religio-political imperialist powers have viewed these kinds of diversity of cultural forms. And these issues remain very important for our contemporary times because we are faced with similar challenges in terms of defining identity, in terms of understanding identity, in terms of understanding history through our cultural productions, through our literary productions. I'm not talking of core history as they do from archaeology, etc. That's not my expertise. But its literariness, its culturality, they all become very important for us. So this kind of knowledge transfer. Culture was not an issue in language contact situation. They never talked about it in earlier times, but in our times it becomes very important. So language, does it define culture? Which is the culture of India? If we take only language as the parameter, it becomes very important for us to understand the differences and the similarities that exist within Indian culture. But we do talk of something like Indian culture with all our linguistic differences. So language contact situations, culture does not become an issue. A Marathi and a Bengali can share the same platform on Sanskriti. Even the word Sanskriti, it has pervaded, which originated in Marathi, according to Suniti Kumar Chatterjee's essays. It started in Marathi and it has pervaded several Indian languages. So language we use to try to define identities. In history, it has happened in Europe, 14th, 15th century. For the first time, it starts happening in Europe in 15th century, approximately the same period, 1552, etc. You will find in 16th century, it happens. But prior to that, we never identified language as the defining parameter for identities. And in our times, again, it is becoming a very complex issue. Which is my language or which is your language? Do we say that we speak only one language? We don't speak any more mother tongue. There are mother tongues for each person. So the linguists would tell us there are first languages. So which is your language? And look at the identity. Look at the identity of several thinkers when they associate themselves to any language, whether it is Spivak, related to Bengali, or related to French, or related to English, which is her language. And even for a common Bengali, which is the language from Bengal. If we say Bengali, does it have only one variety? If I say Hindi, does it have only one variety? There are varieties within the language. So there are first language contact situations when we are born. And nowadays, with multipolarity in family, people coming from various backgrounds, and let's say a child from UP and the family gets the job in Gujarat, and the two partners, husband and wife, they are not necessarily from UP. One partner can be from Tamil Nadu, the other can be from UP, and both of them living in Gujarat, which is the language of the child. So ultimately, the cultural production is taking place, and that is bound to influence on, to have influences on our literary productions and our thought process itself, because there is a new identity emerging, and that is very similar to what we have seen in past. So something that is very obvious to us, something that is right in front of us. We have parameters in past, we need to revisit them and we need to understand them. So Language was there for knowledge transfer. That is perfectly all right. But culture was not necessarily defined as language. And today we say language is the most important carrier of culture. That is true. Knowledge, yes. Knowledge transaction, yes. There is an aspect of culture also. We cannot deny it. But language evolves, culture evolves together. Knowledge evolves, but past knowledge also remains knowledge. It's not that the past knowledge is relegated and it becomes useless. It may not be relevant in a particular time, but it doesn't get immediately wrong if it is knowledge. So evolution of language, evolution of culture, they may happen. Amalgamations may happen, but knowledge, whether past or present, they remain intact. So in that context, we have to understand the role of language and by what do we define our identity. Suppose there is a Tamil way of doing something, because Tamil Nadu has its own climatic conditions. Bengal has its own climatic conditions. France has its own climatic conditions. Hong Kong may have its own climatic conditions. All of them will do similar things differently. So that is knowledge. Linguistically, we may get similar. There could be cultural assimilations, but knowledge transfer remains very crucial. And that is where our cultural identity and language, linguistic identities are questioned, because we need to adopt and understand the language that is relevant for that place. And our literary productions are often closely related to that. So we need to understand these aspects. But somewhere, what the issue has been that the monotheist powers, fueled with political ambitions, as I have given you examples of imperialist Romans, and later you can see from 16th century onward some kind of colonizing and unifying factors, whether they came due to some kind of Christian notion of the world or some kind of requirement for governance. All this can happen. But important point is that the dead archaic forms remained in use as identity and culture. And that's where you see there is a lot of icons of identity which are archaic forms. You take you take any European country, because they have worked a lot on it, and you see what is their cultural icon, what is their political icon, what are the symbols of Germany, what are the symbols of France, how do they try to identify, let's say, United Kingdom. If you ask them, how do you identify Scotland, what are your cultural icons, contemporary cultural icons, film stars, etc., that is different. But at the same time, there is always a historical aspect to it. So the language has evolved. The powers have changed. Everything has changed. But we stick to that cultural identity, which is somewhere in the past. And that cultural, as a symbol of cultural identity, that remains very important. But they may not be very important for our knowledge productions today. That knowledge is also valid because it was in past, but the knowledge may not be valid today. And we need to understand several such situations. I can give you examples. If you take the culture of Inuit and the literary productions of Inuit, some of texts you can see in translation, you can see how their knowledge has changed. From their traditional knowledge, they have changed to their contemporary times knowledge, which is heavily dependent upon technology. So how do they survive in different situations? That is knowledge. They have to survive in extreme cold conditions. Their forefathers had that knowledge. But today, the language, culture, etc., everything is changing due to amalgamation, due to influences of English and French. And accordingly, the knowledge is changing, which can become a problem. Change of identity, not necessarily a big problem, because they evolve, culture evolves. But knowledge change, if it is not relevant to the conditions, if it is not maintained by the texts, if it is not maintained by the folklore, how do you transfer it to your children? Because that kind of knowledge cannot be transferred unless and until it becomes a habit. Just by knowing, let's say, how to cook, I cannot cook. I can read 100 books on cooking, but I cannot cook. I can read 20 books on surgery, but I cannot become a surgeon. So knowledge is something that we have to do, and that has to become part of our habit. And that aspect we have to integrate in our understanding of culture, understanding of identity. So apart from these, you can see several formation of cultural identities have happened, and then we don't talk anymore of cultural identity, but cultural identities. You can see in past it has happened. Another example from the same history of Europe, because history of Europe is the defining factor here for the world. But Germans broke for first. They said, we will not accept the Christian identity. They became Protestants. Martin Luther King and so many others, you will find them. The folk tradition celebrated till date, you will find the resurgence of folk deities and folk traditions. They have started accepting and challenging the kind of strict orthodoxy. And you will find the difference between, at this level, the Protestant societies and the Catholic societies. Max Weber has given a brilliant analysis on this, and how cultural and economic and political processes have gone together in this context. We need to re-understand and re-look those processes and those kinds of cultural productions. Joan of Arc, we all say, but what is the folklore on Joan of Arc? How many ways are there to understand Joan of Arc in the folk mind? We need to understand. So there could be an attempt to understand the proselytization in a particular manner. But the issue of identity, even after proselytization, remains very important in various parts of Europe. Here, by proselytization, I mean the adoption of various factions within Christianity itself in the context of Europe. And they all can provide us the parameters by which we can understand various other religio identity cultural debates that is happening across the world. So language, contact, bonds, you can see there are several political games that is happening around us, and we need to visit it again and again. Another example for this, which I have not prepared here in this, but you can see the production of mangas. Which Japanese mangas are being accepted? Which literature of Japan is being accepted in English by all of us? Murakami is very important for us. Is it a Japanese literature, or is it an English literature that has that has been produced by someone who originated in Japan? But it is English literature. It is not Japanese literature completely, but there are several mangas which are available in Japan, for the simple reason that the issue of what do we see, an adult Japanese would like to see animated movies. The same may not be true here in India or in the US. So how do we produce, and for whom, the adult identity and the child's identity? How is it being formed? How is it being understood? What are the parameters for understanding the identity? What language and culture I have put into question. Then language related to culture, in relation to culture, is definitely questionable. I have given you examples, Persepolis, Jumpalavi, many others. So in this situation, what has happened? If we want simply to politically dominate the issue of identity, then we face onslaught of languages. This is what is happening. Now we are talking of endangered languages and several other aspects of it along with endangered languages, endangered cultures, endangered species, etc. All this, they all go hand in hand together, because even endangered species is related to our knowledge of the nature. So that becomes a very important aspect, whether we understand it in terms of kind of ecological concerns or simply human concern, because it is identity. How do we define ourselves? And here is an example. We do talk of mistaken language. Language, there could be mistakes. In culture, mistaken culture. Okay, I took you as for a Bengali, not a Bangladeshi. So there is a mistaken culture. Identity can be often mistaken identity. We can define it. We can define it, but identity and language, they don't become shared platforms as much as culture becomes a shared platform. I have given you an example of Indian culture. West Indian culture, we have expressions like North Indians, South Indians. In South Indian culture, it doesn't happen. In South India, it doesn't happen in this way. In Asian countries, it doesn't happen this way. And there are very concrete examples for this. When you buy a simple product, let's say Maggi, You find different tastes in different countries. And there is a lot of cultural research going on in these aspects. So research on taste, research on our understanding, how do we eat, and the subsequent change in the habits of eating. How do we accept a particular item? You can see that in previous generation, Maggie was not considered a food. And today, if you in a schools, they accept Maggie as food. In cuisine classes, you will find these examples. So we have several other aspects of it. The culture can be shared, language can be shared, but can identity be shared? It can be evolved, and it does evolve, but can it be shared? Can it be transformed with internal evolutionary processes? My identity will remain my identity. Wherever I go, I will have to pass through the identity of an Indian, wherever I go in the world. So that baggage I keep. My culture can change, my language can change, but identity, how do we change it? Just like Sappho. Sappho's identity remains the same situation that we see in past. We find several such examples across the world. And these examples have not been theorized, though on name of Orientalism, there is one response. But that response is not perhaps sufficient for us in our Indian contexts. Because somewhere, when Orient of Edward Said was being relegated in the background by the European scholars, Euro-American scholars, the Indian thought process was being brought in, the diversity, the paganism of India, which was a kind of living reflection of the old Greek and Roman antiquity, that was taking shape in the mind. And if you see entire 19th, late 19th, fin siècle literature and all the fin siècle modernism, you find a clear reference to something that is coming from India. There are several poets who directly refer to India, T.S. Eliot being foremost of them, and several others, not why only T.S. Eliot. There are authors in Europe who have taken names from India. Uh, they have identified themselves a lot with Indian thought process, and it has continued in 20th century also. So cultures, subcultures, all these form identity. And the defining characteristics of each culture and each language would be diverse. But identity, how would we define? What will be the diversity? What will be the diverse parameters to define identity of being an Indian? Or any identity, being a Tamil, being a Marathi, because within Maharashtra you will find several languages, you will find um, uh, several cultural formations. And we have seen that Konkanis were considered Marathis, later they became different. Tomorrow, Ahirani can become a separate cultural identity, whether we can become a separate cultural identity. But in terms of identity, culture, language, we keep defining. But the moment they get dissociated, there is a larger category on identity, and that becomes a problematic space. Why it becomes a problematic space? I here, while thanking you, we have to approach the whole issue with this mindset. But you see the saguna of bhakti poets we see, we can see in several forms, that even God is to be understood. God, which is a kind of monotheist, which is kind of formless, but it has to be understood by each one of us by our own mind. And that is my identity. So how I conceptualize God, how you conceptualize God, if I ask you to represent God, if you ask me to represent God, our representations will be different. So such representational characters that we conceptualize for understanding God is very much reflected in the bhakti poetry. That's why each one can have its own representation of the Almighty. And we need to understand that each one in that process creates one's own identity. And we need to understand these kind of mental processes which contribute to formation of several identities and several expressions for each identity. We need further research in that historical context, which I have placed, because those contexts somewhere are missing, so far as I know, from our university curricula, our research framework. There could be several reasons for this. Perhaps we need to enter into the languages, those language domains, because a lot of texts we get from mediations of Americans. Perhaps we need to overcome that also. So gradually, if we aim at that, perhaps that is what we need to achieve, and perhaps we can achieve gradually. So as I had said, that we should have some time at the end for your interventions, discussions. So now is the time for that discussion and your comments, queries, your the points by which you want to contradict me. That's most important. Welcome.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a session very deep, very heavy, and it requires lots and lots of pondering over how the culture, identity, and language has to be taken. So I request all the participants to unmute themselves if they have any question, or if they want to write even in the chat box, I can read out the questions for them. If they have any doubts, queries. So by the time the participants ask the question, I had one thing, like I'm from Bihar, and many of us we migrate into another state, and then over a period of time we acquire their language, our slang change, our pronunciation changes, and like after some years we shift, uh, if I can say, our identity. So, and you have also talked about it. So, in general sense, is it a good thing, or like we are depleting or we are putting a full stop to our original identity?
Well, let me put it in a gender perspective. When a girl gets married in the Indian society, she goes to her in-laws' place, change of identity. And in her in-laws' place, she is always known by the place where she belonged to. That's a very common way of addressing her, that this woman belonged to that village, if you see the earlier
Yes,
generations.
sir. Yes, sir.
So see, this is the change of identity. That was for marriage. Marriage could be one reason, but there could be other reasons for similar kind of migrations. Now, is it good to get married or not? So you see, in terms of good and bad, very difficult to define. The fact is that it is happening, whether it is good or not, but it is bound to happen. The
The
political
shift in the
situation.
identity is
Yes.
bound to happen.
It's bound to happen, whether we like it or not. Someone may like it, someone may not like it, uh, for various reasons. See, today you have gone somewhere to some other land, other land. I mean, you are part of India itself, but within India, you have gone to a different subculture of India, different cultural, very rich culture. But even in earlier times, you hear this, that the poor Brahmin, he was so poor, but and then he went to the king of the other state. He
Yes.
traveled a lot to visit the king. He has studied somewhere. You have scholars from Takshila to Vikramshila in various times, and they came from all across the world. So whether for the purpose of movement, uh, in times of war, in times of peace, whatever be the purpose, or economic activities, political activities. There are various personal reasons also for movement. So there could be various reasons, but movement is definitely going to happen in society. As we say that in our contemporary times, uh, for the first time in history, uh, a lot of people are moving from one place to the other place just for the purpose of peace, some peaceful activities like tourism.
Yes.
So you see people come to India and they live here for 6 months. In 6 months, they are living with a different kind of identity. There are hippies, hippie generation in 20th century. They came to India and they lived for some reasons. They came. So there is always an internal evolution of identity, various types of evolution. There could be contradiction, there could be a stress, there could be pleasure. And in each movement, all these aspects will be there. Sometimes you may not like the food where you have gone. At the same time, you may enjoy several other aspects. You may enjoy the freedom. You may like to speak in your own language and nobody around you
Hmm.
understands it.
True, sir.
So
Yes.
this, so that also happens here. Here you are, and you can't talk to your child because everybody will understand. So many things are there. So in terms of good and bad, we cannot identify. But yes, we need to understand these kind of changes that are happening within us, and we need to have a theoretical framework to understand it. So for that, I have presented the historical scenario because until now the somewhere in terms of critical thought, we have not sufficiently addressed these issues so far as I understand.
Yes, sir. Sir, in the chat box, there is one question by Dr. M.G. Priya. Can we connect such research with memory studies?
Memory is become is certainly a part of it, but because see, you define your identity in terms of memory also. So memory itself is a parameter for identity. When we talk of identity, memory studies is just a sub part of that because how do you define yourself? Well, just now, Dr. Poonam defined herself as a Bihari because she has a memory of Bihar. And you have just think of, I don't know about Dr. Poonam, just think of a Bihari girl getting married to a Tamil boy. It's a very something not unheard of in our contemporary times. So what would be her memory and what would be her identity? And situations could be just vice versa also. A couple where a boy from Tamil Nadu can be there and can stay in India. Sorry, and can stay in Bihar for several professional reasons. This is happening across the world. Indians getting married to Australians and so many things. So memory definitely is a part of formation of identity. But memory of what? Is it a personal memory? Is it a social memory? That also needs to be understood because social memory are there and that may form a larger identity. Like Parsi communities, they have a different kind of memory. You had a speaker I saw in your brochure, the first Professor
The
Kama,
first session, sir. Yes, sir.
first session, and she is, I think, president or director of that what is that?
Parzar
Parzur.
Foundation.
So what is Parzur? How do you define this word, Parzur? So far as I have understood, I may be wrong, you can correct me. Parsi and Zoroastrians, that gives us the word Parzur. Now look at it. As such, we will not understand Parzur, but Parsis, part of
Mm.
memory, Zoroastrian, it may be their living faith also, but you see, Parsi being identified with a land. In India, they are called Parsis because they are identified with a land. Religion is not even identified. They are not identified by their culture or by their religion. They are identified by the land. So the memories of what? And this is an issue. You can see among the Jews, this issue has played a very important role in their history. So memory also has a lot of nuances within itself. So memory can become a larger issue in understanding uh, identity, definitely. But just memory is not sufficient because, as I have said, even if you have a memory, suppose you ask just now, Dr. Poonam agreed that she enjoys the freedom of using her language. Now you see, she knows a language and she has a memory, but there are other aspects where she enjoys her present identity. So so memory studies are there, but where memory fails us, where memory takes us, does it take us to our happier states necessarily? All these aspects need to be looked into. So it can be connected, definitely. A simple answer will be yes, it will be connected, but we have to go into the nuances and the deeper aspects of it.
So there is Rekha Bhatt who is writing that the session was very comprehensive and enriching, and she needs time to digest. And I would totally agree with it. I guess that is what makes you you, sir. That I introduced Sharnaaz Kama, but I never uh, put a thought over her foundation, Parzar Foundation. and you just looked at the brochure and you went deeper into it and tried to find out that what this word means. I guess that was the thing I was talking in the beginning of the session, that how much we can be benefited through your session and from your wisdom. So once again, I request all the participants, if they have any question. I guess not. Uh, Your session was itself so comprehensive, sir, that we understood everything. We extend our heartful gratitude to you for this thought-provoking session on identity history, revisiting the apparent obvious. Your insightful analysis and the detailed explanation of our identity and the history have greatly enhanced our understanding and inspired deeply to reflect on these complex themes. The perspective which you have given has definitely broadened our understanding of the dynamic relationship between linguistic practices and cultural identity, inspiring deeper reflection on the significant intersection. Thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank all the participants also for their enthusiastic involvement and active contributions during the morning session. We look forward to seeing you all again at 2 p.m. for the sixth session of our FDP, where we will continue this journey of multidisciplinary exploration. Thank you, everyone.